he's written a bestseller. It sold 250,000 copies. And it's still selling. And he's writing another one. And I can't even spell. I'm semi-bloody illiterate. They must hate my guts, eh?
We love a good controversy, don't we, folks? Especially when it comes to what is or isn't real in a movie based on real events. Andrew Dominik's Blonde is the director's first narrative feature film in a decade, and only his fourth since 2000. It's about the life of Norma Jean Baker, better known as Marilyn Monroe, but like the novel it's based on, it's a largely fictional story. But like Dominik's other work, Blonde isn't concerned with real events so much as it is with our perception of them.
It's murder, and they're squeamish. Oh, for f***.
His films may not be strictly based in reality, but they use real-world people and events to make more truthful commentary than most factual biopics could ever hope to. Because, to get to the real truth, you have to dig past the bright, shiny, mythical exterior hiding the unpleasantness of the world. In addition to Blonde, his other three films, similarly, are all about deconstructing myths that exist in the public consciousness, not only in his native Australia, but American myths and the way they take hold. Sometimes his approach is direct, through stories about famous figures and how they're seen, both by others and by themselves. But sometimes it's about critiquing a more nebulous myth, like the idea of America itself as a land of glamour and opportunity. But like any good story, the tale of director Andrew Dominik starts at the beginning.
None of us are going to be able to help you on this occasion, much as we'd like to.
Well, I put it to you that that's not the truth.
Some people like their biopics to stick close to reality, but Dominik's first film, the 2000 Australian crime indie Chopper, tells you what you need to know up front in its opening titles. Set in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it follows notorious Aussie criminal Mark Brandon Reed, aka Chopper, played by Eric Bana, across various stints of freedom and incarceration. But what's unique about Chopper as a biopic is that while it undoubtedly distorts reality, it lives in close approximation to it. Not only was Reed still alive when it was made, but it was based on his own autobiographies, to which Dominik added more than a few flourishes. The reason for this becomes apparent in the opening scene, in which Reed, who spent most of his life in prison for various murders, watches an interview of himself on TV. This is how we're introduced to the character through the eyes of the media, and through his victims. When it cuts back to the real Chopper, or the movie's version of the real Chopper anyway, he's both fascinated and unnerved by what he sees. He loves the attention and loves the stories people tell about him, but he knows, deep down, the way truth and fiction go hand in hand. The rest of the film portrays Chopper as supernaturally powerful, through the way he has casual conversations when he's stabbed, or when he barely flinches when he decides to have his own ears cut off in prison. It's inhuman, almost godlike, but it's the kind of boastful story an inmate like Chopper would tell about himself. He's a killer, but a supposedly conflicted one, who has no trouble murdering people in cold blood, even though he immediately regrets it. He's a walking paradox, and Bana portrays his contradictions in incredible hues. But what makes Chopper's exploits intriguing is the way the film shifts and changes whenever he's the one telling the story. When it enters these narrative segments, essentially flashbacks within a larger flashback, it reduces motion blur and becomes jittery, playing out almost on fast forward. This sort of comedic approach turns the very idea of truth into a farce. As Chopper says, he never lets the truth get in the way of a good yarn. So, the point of these stories within stories, told about a man who would eventually write his own story, seems to be that no matter what the truth is, a good tale is always more entertaining. The real Chopper allegedly showed no remorse for his killings, but Bana's conception of the man, as a conflicted figure torn between his conscience and his violent impulses, makes for one hell of a movie.
You've probably read all the newspaper stories about me.
Oh, you know what I got right next to my bed? Is The Train Robbers, or Story of the James Boys by R.W. Stevens.
And you've heard the word on the street about me, and you've got a picture in your head of what bloody Chopper Reed's like.
They're all lies, you know.
Of course they are.
Where Chopper skirted the truth in more tongue-in-cheek ways, the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford is a more thoughtful examination, both visually and thematically, of the impact stories can have on people. Its moody voiceover introduces us to notorious outlaw Jesse James, but things seem a little off. We're told about James's well-documented condition that caused him to blink more than usual, but it's over a shot of his unbroken gaze. This story isn't about the real Jesse James, but the myth, born through pulp novels and urban legends, the kind that aspiring gunslinger Bob Ford read when he was a kid. Ford bases his entire identity around James and the stories he's read about him, as an adventurous cowboy shooting and stealing his way through the Wild West. For scenes of the men together and for other transitory shots, legendary cinematographer Roger Deakins wanted to evoke the camera lenses of the era, creating frames with frayed edges like the brushstrokes of a painting, or blurs encapsulating the corners of each frame like blurred lines between truth and fiction. The more Ford learns about James, the more he begins to despise him. And it would seem the more he despises himself, as if he resents and feels betrayed by the stories he so strongly believed. He often sees James through glass, and as the story goes on, his vision of the former hero grows more distorted, as if even up close James is unknowable. Maybe that's what riles Ford up the most, the idea that he's met his hero, but the man in front of him is even more of a mystery than the man on the page. Maybe he prefers that version, the mythical James, to the real thing. Like Dominic's Chopper, the assassination of Jesse James features a similar thread about how myths self-perpetuate through the way people tell stories, about others and about themselves. There's Ford's glamorous view of James, the cowboy, through the stories he read, but his clashes with James' own view of himself as he narrates eerie flashbacks in third person of how some of his actual killings went down, including Ed Miller, a man who was a friend to him and the Ford brothers. Just as chilling is the myth that grows after the titular assassination, not just because it turned James into a martyr and an even bigger myth in the process, but the myth of Jesse James would also grow because of how Ford and his brother would tell and retell the events on stage, reliving the ugly betrayal over and over again until it consumed them. Side note, the man singing about the assassination here is one of the film's composers, Nick Cave, about whom Dominic would make 2 documentaries. But what you're seeing here is a nod to the origins of the movie itself. It was based on the book by Ron Hansen, which took its title from an old folk song, the very same song Cave is singing in the film. For most people, this song is where the popular legend of Jesse James began, and the way it would perpetuate over the years, framing the murderous outlaw as a Robin Hood figure even though he never really gave to the poor. Ford may have been liberated from his belief in his fictitious hero, but in the end he would get caught up in his own legend, and he would himself become the target of an assassination because of it, only without all the glitz and glamour that made the outlaw Jesse James so beloved in the American imagination.
I honestly believe I'm destined for great things, Mr. James. You give me a chance, I get the job done, I guarantee you that.
See, it's not so much what you've been doing. It's what guys think you've been doing.
Hope to be a gunslinger like the nickel books are about.
I haven't got no idea.
The assassination of Jesse James builds to a pretty downer ending, but it turns out Dominic was just getting started. His next film, Killing Them Softly, would begin on a sour note with the lofty promises of presidential candidates, contrasted with visions of America's economic downturn, a light at the end of the tunnel, but even the escape is filled with trash and rubble. The 2012 film is based on George Higgins' crime novel, Cogan's Trade, and it's the only one of Dominic's 4 narrative films not based on real people. Well, other than Presidents Bush and Obama, whose voices you hear throughout the story.
There's only the road we're traveling on as Americans.
The time period is obviously different from the original novel, which was written in 1974, but the story is largely adapted as is, only it's now set against the 2008 presidential election and the recession at the time. And while the novel is set in Boston, Killing Them Softly doesn't give its town a name, but it was shot in New Orleans, where Hurricane Katrina had ravaged the landscape just a few years prior. Killing Them Softly takes aim at 2 myths in particular, which both go hand in hand. The first is the myth of the American gangster as a glamorous figure in Hollywood cinema. Dominic evokes the works of Martin Scorsese on occasion, but rather than criminals who enjoy their line of work and reap its rewards before their downfall, he presents his thieves and killers as people barely getting by, trudging along sadly and silently as they reminisce about better days. They're empty, and like most of America at the time, even their line of work has been hit hard by the recession. They're wasting away, and you get the sense that no one in this movie is ever going to get rich. There are barely any civilians in the film, which becomes about criminals robbing each other and paying each other to kill each other, essentially an industry eating itself, and people screwing each other out of money in the process, even tiny amounts. The glory days are over, both for the American gangster and for America.
Christ's sake. This country is I'm telling you.
It all builds to a gut punch of a finale where Brad Pitt's mob assassin Jackie Cogan, who's being underpaid just like everyone else, lays out the message in stark and direct terms.
America's not a country. It's just a business. Now pay me.
All of this happens as a new president is elected on a message of change, and the movie came out right as he'd been re-elected on a message of hope. It may have seemed like a nihilistic view at the time. Audiences largely rejected the movie, but looking back at it now from yet another recession, it seems to have been prophetic. Cogan calls America a business rather than a country or a set of ideals, laying bare the truth behind the mythical idea of America as the land of opportunity. In Killing Them Softly, it's nothing more than a land of despair. And few people are as good at tapping into that despair, which lurks beneath shining lights and lofty promises, than Andrew Dominik.